up the idea of whether the Vikings would be NFC North champs, and their over under is 9 wins, which I think is right exactly on the money as Vegas usually is with their over unders, making it very difficult because I picked every game as everyone does when the schedule came out, and I came up with 10 wins. So, how are you feeling about this over under? If I gave you, say, $100 of money, Eric, to bet on the Vikings, you had to go over or under, which one would you go?
My colleague George is sending me 16-0 was his
Oh,
pick, so
okay. Sure, of course.
he's bullish. So I would I mean, so when we simulate the season a bunch of times, the schedule is sort of this tough thing, right? Because the way that the NFL works, it's not a bunch of independent games, right? You have, the loss to Buffalo followed by a Thursday night in LA, right? Like those two things are, correlated to some degree. So, we basically, I mean, nine is not a terrible number. We'd probably put it more like 8.5. We would go under nine about 52% of the time. Exactly nine about 18% of the time, and then over the rest, so about 31. So
So you would be going the under.
I would go the under for the second straight year. Yeah.
Okay, so explain that to me then, because the expectation here is that the things that didn't work last year were fixed, and even though we
Yep.
talked about the positional value of selecting Garrett Bradbury, I don't think he would have to be tremendously bad to play worse at center than what they got last year. Even though I like Pat Elflein, he was playing through injuries and with the division and so forth and everything else. I
Yep.
didn't disagree with the PFF grade that had him at the bottom of the league for centers. So that's going to improve. I think Elfline plays better left guard than Tom Compton. I mean, maybe someone emerges as a third wide receiver, but the scheme definitely should be better, and the play calling should be better because I was thoroughly underwhelmed by John DeFilippo's play calling as well. So all of those things, you only have to get one more win. And if you go back through even what they did last year, plenty of opportunities to get that one more win with slightly better play calling, slightly better blocking, slightly better kicking, for example, potentially. So how do we not come up with one more win?
Yeah, but I mean, you sort of look back at it and think about it differently, though. I mean, the Vikings got to play the AFC East last year, so three of those teams should have been clear wins, and frankly, two of them were. They also got to play an NFC West, and they got to play San Francisco when they were sort of straight up, but they got to play Arizona, and a team like Seattle was up a little bit on them and things like that. But you look at their division, Green Bay and Detroit were both down and quite a bit, and so they got those 3.5 wins in that stretch. So if you look at that, we all, as if you're a Vikings fan, you like to say, okay, we got better everywhere. But all these other teams also got better everywhere. And so you look at, like, for example, where they're starting out this season, you know, they play at home against the Falcons. The Falcons were a team that, if they don't have their entire defensive backfield injured, are probably a playoff team. And you're at home week one, that could very well be a loss. Then you go to Green Bay week two. Again, Green Bay was one of the most dysfunctional teams a season ago. You barely squeaked out of there with a tie. You get home to the Raiders, probably win, but then you go to Chicago, right? Well, 1-3 start for the Vikings is a possibility, right? And so when you start out 1-3, like, the rest of the season is not independent of that start. It's not just losing a random 3 out of every 4 games. So to me, I think, like, you look at that, they face the Eagles. They face a bunch of teams that I think also their fan bases could also say all the things the Vikings fan bases do, which is, like, we got unlucky last season a bunch of times, and we shored up all the weak spots, and we're ready to go. But that's literally every team in the NFL this season. Like, it could be Detroit, for example, which was, like, basically they had 2 cakewalks against them last year. So that's kind of where I think we sort of regress every team and see how it shakes out.
So to this point about things that didn't go their way, there were definitely some that did. In fact, the fact they were able to survive a lot of losses on the defensive side and still be fourth best in yards in the
Mm-hmm.
entire NFL, ninth in points, but a lot of that is pick sixes and things like that. If you remove the pick sixes, the fumbles for touchdowns, and compare it across the league, I think they were like fourth or fifth in the total points allowed. And the fact that they were able to survive the loss of Anthony Barr for a couple games, survive the loss of Trey Wayans and Xavier Rhodes, I, I think part of that was who they played a lot of the times. I mean, they had really good performances against Detroit. I mean, Eric Hendricks, I think, is not playing the game against Detroit, but it didn't matter at all because they kept handing the ball to LeGarrette Blount for some reason, right? I mean, there are certain things like that where, yeah, you actually kind of caught some good breaks at times too. And the other thing that stuck out to me as I was looking through the Pro Football Focus quarterback annual, which is insanely in depth and awesome, is the fact that Kirk Cousins actually had really good numbers against pressure or when he was pressured, which is unusual for his
Yep.
career. Usually against pressure, he has a pretty mediocre quarterback rating, somewhere in the 60s. And last year it was up in the 80s, and he was one of the better quarterbacks under pressure. I don't know if that's going to happen again.
Yeah, I mean, we know that Kirk talked about the fact that his play with play action was not something that's characteristic of him, but more of play action in general. Pressure is the same thing, right? We look at a lot of these pop-up seasons by quarterbacks, whether you look at 2015 Carson Palmer, you look at 2013 Josh McCown, like all those are propped up by these seasons where they got really lucky against pressure. Sam Bradford in 2016 was the same thing in his career season. So that's bad. Like if you look at that and say, okay, that regresses more towards 70, then he's got to be better again in clean pockets where he was only 22nd in grade. So that's a good thing to point out. Here's another thing, and the NFL Network thing talked about their final two games: home against Green Bay, home against Chicago. Before that stretch, though, they go, November 3rd at Kansas City, November 10th at Dallas. They get home to Broncos, but the Broncos are no cakewalk. They have a really good defense. They have really good secondary. They got Vic Fangio, who gave them fits a season ago. Then road at Seahawks on the 2nd of December, home against Detroit, and then on the road to the Chargers. I mean, if they win, they'd be lucky to win half of those games, right? In this season, given what we think about all those teams. So it's a tough schedule for them, and it's one of those things where, again, we ask the question like, why doesn't Kirk win in primetime? Well, he's not winning in primetime because they're playing teams like Dallas in primetime, and Dallas is one of the best defenses in the NFL, so of course he's not going to play as well.
The Vic Fangio point is one that I haven't really thought of at all. And I was kind of looking at that Denver game like, wait, Joe Flacco or maybe Drew Lock at that point if things don't really go well. But last year, week 17, the Chicago defense comes in with a lot of talent and a really, really smart defensive coordinator and confounds Kirk Cousins and confounds Kevin Stefanski and beats the Vikings in their house. And it might not be that different. Like you're right about that is I kind of, because of who's playing quarterback, I kind of just mark that down as a win and move on because it's Joe Flacco against Mike Zimmer. And usually if you're not an elite quarterback, you're not having a great day against Mike Zimmer. But the fact that Fangio had the answers for Kirk Cousins in both of those games and is bringing back a lot of talent, that is one that maybe we don't mark down as a guaranteed win.
Well, and Denver has their pass rushers, right? Von Miller, right, on the turf, which we saw like the Buffalo Bills came into Minnesota, nothing for quarterback, right? But Jerry Hughes and others had a really easy time against Kirk Cousins rushing the passer on that turf, right? So that's just something to think about. I mean, obviously there are some things in their schedule. They get a nice little stretch there where 3 out of their 4 games are against the Giants, against the Eagles, Lions, and then Washington, right? That's a nice little stretch there, but they kind of have to get through that first month for that to be relevant for them. So the big thing here is if you're going to bet a team's over, you're essentially implicitly betting other teams' unders. And when I look at the NFC North, I think Detroit's going to be better. I think Chicago, while is not a 12-win team, I think that they're still good and going to beat up on the Minnesotas and the Green Bays of the world. And I think Green Bay has a substantial chance to be pretty good again, right? Just because Aaron Rodgers is probably going to be out there trying to prove to everybody that last season was not him, right? Because he's that kind of prideful person. So, and in addition to be one of the best quarterbacks in the league. So that's like, to me, I just think like in that division, it's really hard for me to point at one of the teams and say that's a 10-win